Recently, I was thinking about video game trends. We've all seen the pattern of trends repeat several times now. Every time a game becomes a breakout success, legions of people copy that game's formula. After a while, developers evolve and deviate from the formula, and that's basically how genres are born. Sure, there were first-person games and even first-person shooters before Doom, but a lot of games that followed in the immediate wake of Doom were simply called Doom clones because they copied their inspiration fairly closely until they eventually were so far removed from Doom that it made sense to call the genre something else. The ASCII dungeon crawler Rogue inspired so many clones that its genre, the roguelike, still bears its name today. And when its mechanics got repopularized by games like Spelunky and The Binding of Isaac, which transferred some but not all of the roguelike characteristics into other genres, developers started making what is now called roguelites with increasing regularity. EverQuest, RuneScape, and World of Warcraft basically cemented what a massively multiplayer online role-playing game is supposed to be, and in their wake followed a large number of games that wanted to capitalize on their popularity. Then came the multiplayer battle arenas or MOBAs like League of Legends and Dota 2, which still occupy the free time of millions of players and also inspired a few other games to throw their hat in the ring. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne famously inspired a huge number of other games that came in their wake that focused on elements like stamina management, slow and deliberate combat, punishing difficulty, level design that folded in on top of itself, and arcane and obtuse storytelling. The most recent trend we're currently inhabiting is the prevalence of Battle Royale games, kickstarted by PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds and firmly planted into popular culture by Fortnite, so much so that the Battle Royale concept has even been implemented into other games like Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Fallout 76, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare as additional game modes. All of these genres have one thing in common. They had a massive breakout hit that changed mainstream gaming in some way and influenced game design in their wake. But there's one genre that seemed to have tons of imitators and players and yet barely made a splash outside of its secluded area of gaming. After the release of the Arma 2 mod DayZ, it seemed like you couldn't save yourself from the endless barrage of imitators that flooded the market soon after. Survival games with crafting elements were officially a new thing that everybody wanted to cash in. Well, at least plenty of indie developers did. Tons of streamers and YouTubers constantly played these games and they were topping the sales charts, especially on Steam, for years. I personally was never all that interested in these games, to be honest. From what I could glean from watching other people play and reading reviews, they mostly consist of nondescript open worlds where you have to craft an ever-increasing number of items to secure your survival against zombies, wild animals, and other players, while keeping any number of meters for hunger, thirst, fatigue, etc. from dropping too low, or you'd die and lose your progress. They seem to focus on these systems and largely ignored actual gameplay or even narrative for the most part. It also seemed like all of them were released in early access, and my personal policy is to never buy a game that is in active development. For one, if I did, I would be buying the game in arguably the worst state it would ever be in. If the developers considered it good enough to officially release and end the early access period, that's when it would ostensibly adhere to their vision and standard of quality, so why should I settle for something less than that as a paying customer? The other reason is that I don't want to encourage developers by giving them money upfront so they can either abandon the unfinished game or radically change its direction further on in development, which both would have me end up with a final product that might not resemble what I would have hoped or expected from it. However, over the years, some of these games ended up in my Steam library nonetheless, interestingly all through bundles sold by Humble Bundle. And since I was never going to delve into these games for the hundreds or even thousands of hours other players invest in these titles, I decided to approach these games in a different manner. Most of these games have been in development for years. As of this video, the only game to still remain in early access is ironically the one that has been in development for the longest. Given that the games that I have tried are either considered finished to the point of not needing the qualifier early access anymore or have been in development for almost a decade, my intent with this video is to give you an impression of what my experience was with these games as a new player, and to come up with a reason why AAA gaming has largely ignored this trend. After all, these games have enticed hundreds of thousands of players to spend countless hours playing them, so there must have been a hook at the very start that drew them in, and I was determined to find if they could achieve the same with me. I decided to give these games between 1 and 2 hours to convince me that they'd be worth playing further. I also played these games in single-player mode wherever possible. I know that this might remove an aspect that many people consider a critical element for their enjoyment. But I'm a firm believer that even an involuntary holiday at Guantanamo can still be fun with friends, and a game needs to hold up on its own merits, not by how much fun I could be having with friends. So please be aware that these are not thorough reviews of any of these games. The following are my experiences with each game in the order I played them for an hour or two, depending on how much I could tolerate playing them. I will talk about what I did with my time with each game and sum up how I felt about the way the game introduced me to its systems and if I felt motivated enough to eventually come back. I started my journey into these survival crafting games with 7 Days to Die. This one is the oldest game of the bunch that I own and the only one that is still in early access, with the latest patch coming out on March 4th of this year. And it also proudly touts the fact that it's the first of its kind right there in its Steam description, which seems like it's tempting fate. I mean, being the first in uncharted territory has never ever meant that you were the best version of it. Surely the latest iteration should be the best one, given that it didn't have to figure things out as it went along. I doubt Leonardo da Vinci's flying machine is any better than a modern airplane. So is being the first in this case a boast or a defense? I'm not really sure. But I do have to say that the game certainly doesn't look like it first came out almost 7 years ago. It actually looks significantly older, with hideously bad character and enemy models, laughable animations, flat and lifeless looking vegetation, ugly textures, and an amateurish looking UI. Suffice to say that I wasn't confident that we were off to a good start. I started by creating the ugliest character I could in the character creator and set off on my adventure. As is typical for these games, you spawn in a patch of land without knowing where you are, how things work, and where you're supposed to go or what you're supposed to do. To the game's credit, it does give you some hints as it tells you what items you should craft and what resources these items require. After having a look around my spawn point, which was near a dilapidated building, and stocking up on some loot that I found in there, I foolishly tried to kill a boar by punching it to death. Let's just say that things didn't turn out so well for me after that. After learning the lesson that wildlife can't be punched into submission so easily in this game, I started my second attempt and got down to actually doing what the game was asking me to. I gathered some plant fibers, crafted a bedroll, and placed it in a safe-ish looking room in the building near which I spawned. Then I crafted the prerequisite stone axe to harvest resources faster than punching them out of the environment, some fiber clothing to ward off the cold, and a wooden club as a means of attack and defense. I felt good for making quick progress here. After that, the game wanted me to craft a bow and some arrows. I already had most of the resources I needed for that, with the exception of feathers. I had no idea where to find those, so I decided to head out to the nearest building I could see in the distance, since maybe I'd stumble across some feathers on the way. I discovered a fortified-looking compound called Trader Joel's. In it, I found an NPC called Trader Hugh, who gave me my first actual quest, delivered by a horrible voice actor. Find some buried loot, and don't forget to bring a shovel along. After crafting the shovel, hiking over to the spot marked on my compass and spending almost 10 minutes digging through a mountain, I finally found my loot and went back to Trader Hugh. Unfortunately, a zombie was patrolling just outside the compound entrance, and since I had a broken leg from an earlier incident where I miscalculated the height of a jump, I couldn't manage to get back in and lock the door behind me, so I got killed again. Fortunately, when I respawned, I didn't wake up somewhere completely different like the first time after I got bested by a boar, so with 2 now fully healed legs, I sprinted back to the site of my previous untimely demise, gathered my belongings, and completed my quest. Since it was already late in the day and I had a hunch that things would only get more difficult during the night, I thought to myself I'd hunker down with Trader Hugh and head out at sunrise for my next quest. It was around that time that I heard Trader Hugh's voice ostensibly through a PA system that informed me that Trader Joel's would be closing soon. No biggie, I thought, I'm safely in here and I'll just stay here. And when Trader Joel's actually closed, it dumped me outside its perimeter to helplessly fend for myself in the immediate vicinity of a zombie. Thankfully, I managed to get back to the house where I had my bedroll, crafted a secure wooden door, and started waiting for sunrise with not much to do in the intervening time. At 4 AM, a music cue informed me that the night was officially over, so I headed out to complete my next quest. On my way there, I got attacked and killed by a wolf. When I respawned and went back to pick up my belongings, the wolf killed me again and I officially called it quits after that. My takeaway from 7 Days to Die is that while it does give new players some direction on what they're supposed to do, it still feels massively unpolished even after these many years of development. I mentioned the below average visuals at the beginning, but even beyond that, the gameplay that I experienced simply wasn't all that refined either. Digging up that mountain to find the buried loot was a chore, fighting zombies even with a sledgehammer isn't worth it, and the combat itself just feels terrible. There's no weight behind swinging a weapon, and I get that you're not supposed to be fighting every zombie you can find, but if you have to get into combat at some point, it still needs to feel right. And having to hunker down at night without much to do wasn't fun either. I'll be honest, I wasn't even sure I wanted to continue with this experiment after I was done with this game. The next game I tried was Ark: Survival Evolved. I played it deliberately after 7 Days to Die to contrast the oldest game of this lineup with the youngest one. Ark might have left early access some time ago, but it still features regular updates through expansion packs and a season pass, which command a hefty price tag if they're not on sale. But since I didn't own any of those, I simply loaded up the vanilla game, which also gets a few content updates now and then, in this case some Easter-themed stuff. Once again, I created the ugliest motherfucker I could and woke up on the shore of an unknown land. And I have to say that at the very least, Ark looks significantly better than 7 Days to Die. It's not a graphical powerhouse by any means and seems to be rather poorly optimized for what it offers if you intend to play it on the higher settings, but at least it reflects the age in which it was released a little more closely. This time around I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing, and the game didn't give me any clues or hints. So I just started with the classic opener of most of these games. I started punching the trees to gather wood, collected rocks that lay around the beach, and crafted a stone pick and a stone axe to speed up the resource gathering. After that, I didn't really have any idea what I was supposed to be doing. Looking at the interface basically told me that craftable items would be unlocking along the way while I was gaining levels. In order to gain experience, I simply had to collect resources, craft stuff with them, and maybe kill a few dinosaurs as well. Oh, I forgot, this game doesn't feature zombies and focuses more on prehistoric wildlife. But it's kinda weird how you can just stay in the starting area where you won't be bothered by any of the animals and hunt most of the lower level ones without having to fear too much retribution while you steadily increase your level, unlock new craftable items, and build your first crude house in no time. It took me a while to figure out why I was still freezing to death at night even though I was crouching right next to a campfire, but once I built 2 additional campfires I managed to survive the night. But even something as simple as lighting a fire isn't explained to you. If you level up, you can unlock these craftable campfires, and you'd think that once you craft it and place it somewhere you can just light it up. But nope, you have to gather some more wood, even though the 3D model of the campfire looks like it already has plenty of wood in it, and then you have to open up the inventory of the campfire itself and transfer the wood in there. Oh, and if you haven't gathered some flint by mining some nearby rocks, you still can't ignite it. I get that logically it would make sense to have to provide fuel and an ignition source to start a campfire, but having to intuit this stuff yourself without any hints is just nonsensical for such a critical element. Especially once you discover that a single campfire doesn't actually provide enough warmth to survive the night. And if you want to cook the meat you can harvest from wildlife, that has to be transferred to the inventory as well, again something I had to figure out myself. My second day didn't significantly differ from the first one. I still had no sense what I was supposed to be doing or what goal I was working towards, so I simply continued gathering and crafting stuff while killing the odd animal on the way and maintaining all the draining meters until it got dark again. By that time, I had a house with a roof, and surprisingly it didn't actually catch fire when I put a campfire inside the house built from twigs and straw. So it's okay for the game to assume that I know how to start a fire by providing it with wood, but the game doesn't punish me for creating a fire inside a flammable building. Okay. In my little homestead, I built a bunch of storage boxes to offload some of the building materials I didn't need since I was constantly getting over-encumbered. After that was done, I once again hunkered down and waited for the sun to rise. It seemed like having to wait for night to pass with little worth doing while you're waiting is some kind of running theme with these games. Once the third day rolled around, I decided to make a beeline towards one of those giant glowing towers in the distance and see what was up with them, since that was basically the closest thing of a goal I could formulate to myself, as the game was still tight-lipped about what I was here for and what I was supposed to be doing beyond not dying. Apparently, as you get closer to these towers, or at least if you stray further from your starting area, animals tend to be at higher levels and also be more aggressive. In other words, I died while attempting to cross a body of water on my way to a tower. So I can't say that I was looking forward to slowly increasing my level by continuing to gather and craft shit just so I could eventually take on these beasts and explore the towers. Because again, if you strip out the gathering and crafting, the actual gameplay seems to be at about the same level of 7 Days to Die. Melee combat again lacks impact and punch, and running after these animals in order to kill them is an exercise in frustration when only every second or third swing actually connects. And the fact that the game absolutely refuses to properly introduce its systems to new players means that on that front it's even worse than the previous game. Let me be upfront here and say that I spent the least amount of time with Sir, You Are Being Hunted. While it's billed as a survival game, it doesn't quite fit the mold of the previous two since it doesn't really feature crafting at all. It leans more towards what Slender the 8 Pages did. You're let loose in a procedurally generated archipelago of 5 islands and you have to scour all over them in order to find some MacGuffins and bring them back to your starting point. Along the way, you have to avoid enemies through simplistic stealth mechanics while searching houses for items that keep you alive. So at least you have more of an outline of what you're supposed to accomplish, but you're still scrounging for resources in order to keep a continuously depleting vitality meter from running out, and the crafting is replaced with aimlessly running around the place. To be honest, this game felt even emptier than the previous two, while ironically being the first one to actually try its hand at some writing and world building right from the start. You're not being hunted by just anyone, no. You're being stalked by posh-looking, tweed-wearing robots with glowing red eyes, while a narrator with a British accent interjects from time to time with quaint but helpful tips whose phrasing are supposed to amuse you. All the towns, and I use the word town very generously if a collection of 5 buildings is supposed to be a town, have overly British-sounding names and try to have some kind of joke as a tagline. So the game wants to feature some comedy, but it just doesn't feel appropriate. There's no actual reason why the game employs what it thinks is hilarious dry British humor, as it doesn't inform the narrative or contrast with what you're doing. I mean, is this some kind of the most dangerous game type of narrative that's supposed to say something about society? Why are you being hunted by tweed-clad robots? It really doesn't matter at all. The lack of effort that went into the concept is also once again evident in the visual style. It's all brown and murky with low detail models and textures. Houses aren't actually buildings you can enter and explore, you just push the use key in front of a door and get to see its contents as an inventory screen. These inventory screens are filled with items that appear to be utterly useless to you. Why even put any inventory items into a game if they're ostensibly worthless to the player? There are tons of dead rats and food items labeled as dubious that decrease your health if consumed, so why would I as a player ever pick them up? This is where a crafting system would have actually helped as a method of combining junk items that on their own are of no use to the player but could be made useful by crafting them into something else. I really didn't have fun with Sir, You Are Being Hunted. Running around aimlessly while trying to avoid enemies was boring, and even when I deliberately attacked some of the robots once I found an axe, the gameplay didn't improve. Apparently, the robots also get more aggressive and competent the more MacGuffins you find, which is an appropriate ramping up of the challenge, but they seem to have been built by the enemies from the first Far Cry games because they can detect you from miles away, and even though they're wielding early 20th century weaponry, their aim at great distances and reload speed is absolutely perfect. They also behave in an unpredictable manner, and the only stealthy thing you're able to do is crouch in high grass and distract them with noisemakers. So even for a game that wants to be played as a stealth game, it's unreasonably unforgiving on top of not being creative enough to give you a reason for wanting to be there. It seems like this game leaned way too much onto the crutch of procedural generation. The islands are procedurally generated, and as a result they all look interchangeable and not the least bit memorable. It can even happen that a ship that's supposed to sail you from one island to the next is anchored inside a lake without any access to the open sea. The names of the towns and their taglines are procedurally generated as well, so there are no landmarks or distinguishing features to any part of these islands. The location of the MacGuffins is always different, so you always have to travel the width and breadth of all of these different yet identical looking islands over and over again. It almost seemed like this game was an exercise in how to get away with putting the least amount of effort into a product, still ship it and have tons of people buy it. I had to call it quits after barely an hour because there was nothing there to motivate me to actually continue playing. While I couldn't quit Sir, You Are Being Hunted fast enough, I honestly was very surprised by how much I enjoyed my time with the forest. It was the first game of the bunch that gave me an actual narrative reason for why I'm even there, and it also gave me a goal I was supposed to be working towards. The game opens up with a plane crash and your son being abducted by what looks like a tribal person. Right off the bat, the game gives you a survival guide that contains all the things you can build, and it loses no time in teaching you the basics. After having played the previous games, those basics were fairly self-evident to me, but if I hadn't, this probably would have been the best place to start given how well documented the mechanics and progression are. Since you start the game near a crashed plane explained, there's a ton of loot already there for you to pick up. For one, the game immediately gives you an axe to chop down bushes and trees, and you get some food, drinks and medicine as well. I started by building a small shelter and a campfire, and then went on to building a log cabin. It took a while to gather all the materials from the surrounding forest, but in the end I was the proud owner of a small little cabin in the woods. And owning a cabin, or any other means of shelter really, also allows you to sleep. This is the first game to realize that waiting for the night to pass is boring if you spend it locked up inside your safe house without doing anything, so it just lets you skip past it and get back to gathering stuff and crafting items. The survival mechanics in this game aren't too aggressive. You don't have too many meters to maintain, and the ones that are there don't seem to drain too quickly, and finding food and water is fairly straightforward and easy. The crafting mechanics differ a bit from the previous games though, since you can't just click on an icon and have the item be built. You have to individually put the ingredients you need into a little crafting square at the center of your inventory screen. Once you put the first ingredient down, it shows you a list of other ingredients you can add to craft different things. Unfortunately, that list is comprised entirely of pictograms, so I had to look up what those meant in order to understand what items I was supposed to be adding. That part seemed a little bewildering, but once I figured it out, I was happily crafting a variety of weapons and other items, as well as upgrading those weapons. It's an overall slower process than the other games, which are a little more straightforward with how the crafting works. Speaking of weapons, you also need something to use them on. During my playthrough, I mostly encountered wild animals that I could kill and butcher without meeting too much resistance, but towards the end of my time with it, I ran across 2 tribal people and got to engage in some direct combat. The forest suffers from similar problems as the other games in that first-person melee combat feels clunky, unresponsive, and lacking punch. Overall, the forest seems to be the most refined variant of the open-world crafting survival game I've played up to this point. The visuals are pretty good, the UI especially is leagues ahead of any of the other games, and it actually gives you a proper introduction along with a decent, if bare-bones narrative hook to justify the actions of the player. Color me impressed. Conan Exiles is the only game on this plate of hors d'oeuvre that was made by what I would call a non-indie developer. Pretty much every other game I've tackled has been either the debut title of the studio or made by a studio that would typically be considered an indie. Funcom, on the other hand, has been around since 1993 and released some games that can arguably be called mainstream. Probably the most well-known other games are the Dreamfall/Longest Journey games, The Secret World, and especially Age of Conan. You probably don't get to use a license even as low in demand nowadays as Conan the Barbarian if you're not at least somewhat of a proven developer. As a result, it's kind of bewildering that they didn't manage to produce the most refined version of the survival craftathon concept yet. I mean, this game is still leagues ahead of 7 Days to Die, and I'd even say it's friendlier towards newcomers than Ark, but it simply doesn't reach the bar of quality that the Forest set. Conan Exiles once again starts off with character creation, but apparently the developers were more focused on permitting players to see their character naked than giving me the satisfaction of designing a monstrosity. I tried to come up with something ugly, but in the end my character still looked comparably normal, and even the smallest set of boobies seemed to fill out at least a D cup. The setup for your character is that they get crucified and left to die out in the desert for dubious accusations of unspecified crimes. Conan the Barbarian appears out of nowhere and saves your character while delivering some truly outstandingly cringeworthy dialogue that sometimes manages to completely play out of sync with the spoken audio, and once that's done, he disappears just as quickly as he appeared. I was left to fend for myself once again, and the game overall is sort of a hybrid between 7 Days to Die and Ark with how you can proceed. There's a list of things the game wants you to craft or do, and you gain experience which unlocks new abilities and crafting recipes. I followed a stony path for a while, and for the longest time I couldn't figure out where to plant my obligatory bedroll that acts as my spawn point. After coming across a convenient oasis within 5-minute walking distance of my supposed place of execution, I encountered some human NPCs battling what looked like an evolved giant turtle. After helping them kill it, I assumed I could be friends with the humans, that they'd maybe teach me how to play the game or something along those lines, when I got attacked and killed by one of them. This pattern repeated a few times until I got the hang of the combat system, which, to the game's credit, is fine for what it is, not being anything special, but I decided to avoid combat in favor of gathering more supplies and finally finding a place to put my sleeping bag and craft some weapons and armor. I managed to collect enough materials to build a small house, and then I wanted to build a wooden box to stash some items. Unlike almost every other item I could craft up to this point, a simple wooden box, no larger than your average chest, took 100 freaking pieces of wood. My experience with Conan Exiles already quickly turned into me running around the area while keeping the gathering button pressed in order to get enough plant fiber, sticks and stones. But now I had to run out and chop down dozens of trees just to build a small wooden box. I could see the writing on the wall with this title around that time. It seemed to be content to ramp up the grind fairly excessively, and again I was left wondering what my ultimate goal in this game was supposed to be. Seeing the prospect of that grind and the lack of a motivation to give a shit where my adventure would eventually lead before me, I simply had to quit the game and not look back. Considering the low bar 7 Days to Die and Sir You Are Being Hunted said, it might come as a surprise to you that the worst experience I had with any game that I'm parading in front of you today was with Rust. My first disappointment came when I realized that there was no convenient way to play Rust as a single-player game without jumping through a bunch of hoops in order to set up a server myself. And I simply wasn't going to do that for a game I'd stop playing after a maximum of 2 hours. So I jumped into one of the official servers, thinking that that's the most obvious place to start the game. As I was accustomed to by now, I woke on a shore and had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. I had a rock and a torch in my inventory and a tutorial in the corner of my screen telling me to gather 100 wood, craft a campfire and place said campfire. But before I could even start gathering resources, I was immediately attacked and killed by another player who seemed to also just have spawned in, judging by the fact that he too was lacking clothes and beating me to death with a rock. After respawning on the same server, I started to harvest some wood, and while I was doing that, yet another dipshit, this time probably way more experienced than me, started opening fire. I tried searching for PvE servers so I didn't have to bother dealing with assholes anymore, but apparently there are no official PvE servers. At least none that would indicate that fact based on their server name, because only the community servers seem to feature said indicator in their names. I connected to one of those servers and saw that the tutorial didn't load in, which was of no use to me since I wanted to actually learn how to play this damn game. It was at this point that I already considered giving up on Rust entirely and just write it off as a terrible experience for first-time players. But after that, I sorted the official servers based on the number of players and found one that seemed to feature the standard map without any special modifiers that had only 33 players on it. So the chance of me running into another shit stain of a player was far lower. It was apparently located in Australia and had a ping of over 300 milliseconds, but I was willing to take the risk just so I could be left in peace while I figured this shit out. Thankfully, the server managed to hold a connection just fine and I was happily running around, banging my rock against some trees to gather the wood. In the meantime, I started wondering why it took 100 wood to build a campfire. Moreover, I started wondering why trees got marked with red X's whenever I hit them. After I looked up that one by googling it, I was made aware that harvesting material happens faster if you hit trees and rocks at just the right place. Great, now I was performing a song and dance routine all around these trees in order to speed up the monumentally boring task of gathering 100 pieces of wood to craft and feed a campfire. The game would have been happy to just let me gather all this stuff way slower because it just couldn't be bothered to tell players that hitting the tree in the right place causes it to dispense more wood. After I managed to tame fire, I was instructed to gather some additional wood and 200 pieces of stone in order to craft the by now very familiar hatchet and pickaxe to further speed up the resource gathering. The wood was no problem, but I had tremendous difficulty mining stone. Apparently, all those boulders and rock faces you can see all over the map are just for decoration. You have to find the special stones that have a little glinting spark and only then can you harvest them. The first one I found was some metal ore, so pretty much useless to me at that point. I ventured further inland on my quest to find some stone when I came across a bear which promptly mauled me to death. Things really didn't want to pick up for me with this game. After respawning someplace else, I noticed that the sun was beginning to set. I quickly gathered up some wood and planted a campfire in the mountains in order to warm myself and get through the night unscathed. This again is a game where you can't seem to actually do much at night, at least in the early stages. There was an Easter egg hunt going on during the night for a few minutes as part of the temporary themed event, which I engaged in for shits and giggles and to pass the time, but that was about it. Once the sun rose, I set out on my quest to finally find some stone to mine, and after trudging through the mountains some more, I finally found one. I quickly mined it and started crafting the hatchet and pickaxe and noticed how much faster my gathering went. At this point, the game told me to gather some cloth and produce a sleeping bag, which, if the other games are any indicator, would represent my spawn point in case I got killed again. But at the same time, my hunger meter started telling me that I was starving. Somehow, I was never made aware of how to acquire food and water in this game. I frantically ran around the place until I found a boar chilling by the beach. I equipped my spear, charged at the boar already salivating, and was immediately killed. So yeah, fuck this game. I might have felt that 7 Days to Die was amateurish and Sir You Are Being Hunted was an empty, boring void. But Rust managed to royally piss me right the fuck off. It's inhabited by complete dickhead PvP players, its tutorial is utterly atrocious in actually communicating where to find resources, the fact that stones can only be mined at special designated areas is a fucking joke, and it can't even tell you how to not die of starvation. I had high hopes for The Long Dark. Doesn't that sentence already foreshadow my thoughts about this game, huh? The Long Dark bills itself as a thoughtful, exploration-driven survival experience, and it even makes fun of the fact that a lot of other survival games feature zombies by explicitly stating that this time around, you're only up against Mother Nature itself and not legions of the undead. The game further got my hopes up by starting off with an actual narrative and a hook that made me want to experience that narrative. After the game opens up in medias res after yet another plane crash, it flashes back to a hangar where, after the game teaches you the basic mechanics, you get a visit from what I think is supposed to be your ex-wife Astrid, with a request to fly her out to some remote place since her skills as a doctor are apparently needed there. Now, there wouldn't be much need for survival if things went smoothly, so after some nicely written and voice-acted dialogue, the plane inevitably crashes and you're back to the point where the game originally started. From then on, I had to gather materials to build a fire and tend to my injuries. While the game does give you specific tasks to complete, like building a fire or sleeping in a cave, it never goes into great detail on how you should actually achieve this. Yeah, I get it, gather some wood, kindling and light a fire with your matches, but how to specifically do this is never taught to you. And you need to figure this shit out quickly because hypothermia sets in really fucking fast in this game and your injuries also aren't helpful in this situation. Also, how do I find water and stave off dehydration? I eventually figured out how to use an empty can I had in order to melt snow and then boil the water to make it safe to drink. But I had tremendous difficulty at first because during the time it took to do all of that, my character ended up dying. After reloading and doing that entire rigmarole all over again, this time in a bit of a hurry, the game told me to rest for the night. But I didn't know how to go to sleep in the cave since there was no option to do so visible anywhere in the UI and I had no way of crafting the expected bedroll myself. It turns out that what looks like a bunch of branches with leaves that lay around the cave floor is considered a bed. Duh. Once I woke up, I still had trouble staying hydrated and hunger also started to set in. I climbed my way out of my predicament since my wounds were now all healed up and I found a bush with some rose hips. Unfortunately, as opposed to real life, I couldn't eat those berries. The game only informed me that I could make some tea with them that would help treat my injuries somehow. I managed to get up to the wreck of my plane and gather up some resources, among them a parka that kept me a little warmer and a single granola bar which barely satiated my hunger. The game then told me to find some clues in order to find Astrid. The cold was still getting to me and draining my health and I was still hungry. I came across a bunch of rabbits and was told to gather some pebbles in order to throw at them in order to stun and catch them. Sounds easy enough. But those fuckers are fast and my character throws in an utterly unpredictable manner. You simply can't aim where the pebble will land, so hunting rabbits with this method is a crapshoot. By sheer luck I managed to hit a rabbit, harvest some meat and return back to the fireplace just in time before I died. I ate the meat, but just like pretty much everything else I ate or drank, it never actually healed me. It only satiated the corresponding meter, and since my character was tumbling around uncontrollably even after getting some meat in his belly because of the low health, he stumbled forward right into the fire and died while making fun of me for being so dumb and walking into a fire. I really wanted to like this game more than I did. It seemed to have some promise behind it given that it features a story mode, a pure survival mode and some challenge modes, and the artistry behind the sound and visuals is leagues above the other games in this roundup. But the tutorial here is atrocious. I get that you're not supposed to be in a situation where you can feel comfortable while you're trying to survive in the freezing wilderness, but at least explain the mechanics in a way that doesn't lead to multiple frustrating deaths within the first couple of hours. Starting off with a severely wounded character who's at risk of freezing to death within minutes might sound believable if this were a real situation, but it's a terrible way of opening up a game about survival if it already stacks the deck against you and refuses to give you proper tutorials on how to stave off death effectively. Over the past couple of days, I spent just shy of 10 hours trying to get into 7 different survival games. I only found one game that was willing to properly teach me its mechanics without forcing me to die pointless deaths or having to consult outside information like a wiki, and only 2 games that had actual narratives that would give me enough motivation to care about why I was even trying to survive in their worlds. The Forest was overall the best experience for me as a new player. It didn't manage to convince me to stick around any longer though, because even while being the best example of what this genre has to offer, it still boils down to busy work while trying to build ever more complex stuff in order to stay alive. That might be enough for some people, but I want more out of my games rather than just a loose collection of crafting and survival mechanics. But my quest here wasn't just to find the best example of what games like this could be. During this video's opening, I mentioned that pure crafting survival games haven't ultimately made their mark on gaming as much as other trends that came and went. I wanted to know why, and I think I might have formulated a reason. Most of the trends I've described in my opening, Doom clones, roguelikes and roguelites, MMORPGs, MOBAs and Souls-likes, have one thing in common. They changed the way we play games. They had a direct influence on how gameplay worked, but they also didn't simply rely on the system they had built into themselves. Doom wasn't just memorable for pointing and clicking enemies to death in pseudo 3D. It was memorable because you were battling demons from hell on Mars to a kick-ass soundtrack. Rogue gave you something new to do every time you went in for a run. MMOs feature persistent worlds where players can interact and go on large adventures with each other. MOBAs give you a large number of varied characters and force you to cooperate with your teammates and come up with impromptu strategies. And Souls-like demand that you pay attention to everything or else you'll suffer quick defeat. But you can put a depleting bar that has to be filled up by consuming items you find in the game world into pretty much every game. Most games already have one or two of those. They're called health and mana bars. Further splitting them up into hunger, thirst, fatigue, etc., making those meters deplete over time and introducing corresponding restorative items is not altering gameplay. It just increases the amount of busy work you have to do in order to stay alive. Similarly, you can put a crafting system into pretty much any game. Tons of games, even titles way older than the ones discussed here, have them in order to give use to the huge amount of clutter you can pick up in these games. And the prevalence of these crafting systems is also a source for criticism. Because ever since games allowed you to craft helpful items on the fly, developers stopped putting all that much care and attention into their level design. Games like Half-Life, for example, didn't let you craft health and ammo. You had to find those by exploring the levels. You couldn't just heal yourself in the middle of a fight, and if you ran out of ammo for your most powerful weapon, you had to improvise and make do with what you had. And developers could gauge how much resources you had at any given point and design the levels and encounters appropriately. So just trying to survive while crafting stuff seems to me to simply not be enough to constitute what a video game should be. If you break down video games, they're all just collections of mechanics. Some mechanics test your dexterity and some your logic, and that's when fun happens. But this core gameplay loop, the thing that you are constantly doing for hours, whatever it may be, has to be fun in and of itself. And I personally don't find it fun to juggle a bunch of meters to simply stay alive while walking all over the place in order to gather resources when in the next game over I can be a superhero or a detective or whatever. And I'm aware that all these games feature some form of combat system in there as well, but as I've discussed, they all feel severely less polished than what I could find in games dedicated to set combat style. It always seems like the actual gameplay beyond crafting and surviving is a perfunctory addition to give players something else to do. It always shows how little effort went into actually developing and designing these gameplay systems in comparison to the crafting and surviving, which are clearly supposed to be the stars of the show. And I simply don't think that focusing on these elements to the detriment of actual gameplay is worth it. I actually went so far and created a basic survival game in Microsoft Excel to illustrate my points, because that was the quickest way for me to replicate some of these systems. I have some values for health, hunger and thirst. Hunger and thirst continuously tick upward, and if they get too high, they start depleting your health. You can avoid dying by gathering and consuming food and water, which lowers their corresponding bars. I also implemented a very compressed and rudimentary version of a crafting system. You can gather wood and stone and craft hatchets and pickaxes that speed up the process of gathering more wood and stone. The point of this is to illustrate that these types of systems on their own aren't interesting gameplay in and of themselves. It's just busy work you have to engage in to keep yourself from dying. And the crafting system doesn't mean much if you can't apply it to anything meaningful. I could implement some additional resources and systems that would eventually mean that I could automate the gathering of resources and make the act of satiating my character's needs trivial, but then I would only be giving players a solution to a problem I created that intentionally bugs them to the point where they want it to go away and not have to deal with it. In other words, constantly babysitting your depleting bars is something that actively distracts you from doing something else, and crafting is only there to make the former more bearable. That's why I personally dislike games that exclusively focus on these two mechanics and don't have a core gameplay loop that would be fun even if neither crafting nor survival existed, and why I won't be playing any of these games anymore after this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this exercise and can relate to my experiences when trying out these games. Again, this video is not supposed to represent deep dives into any of the titles that I've played. It was meant to explore how these games introduce players to their systems and to see if what they present to me in their opening hours is interesting enough to convince me to play some more. If you're a fan of these games, if you've played them for dozens or even hundreds of hours, please don't see this as an attack against you or your preferences. I might not understand what you find interesting when playing these games, but I'm very glad you found something you enjoy in them. I'm not here arguing that games like these shouldn't exist. The conclusion of this video was more a way for me to formulate why I personally don't care about games that focus more on these systems rather than a more engaging core gameplay loop. The reason why I recreated a very simplistic version of these systems in Excel was because that's exactly what I see before my inner eye when I imagine a crafting and survival system. I see a spreadsheet with data that gets manipulated based on values elsewhere in the database, and that just doesn't seem all that fun to me. The other takeaway of this video is that most of these games do a pretty terrible job of introducing their systems to new players. I get that many of these games were originally released in early access and tutorials are never a huge priority while the game isn't finished. But considering that only a single one of the group I discussed here is still in early access, it's bewildering how badly you can introduce the core systems of a game that are supposed to accompany your players the entire time in games that are considered finished. So with that out of the way, do you agree with me? Did I get something terribly wrong here? And if you're a fan of these games, let me know what attracted you to them and kept you playing. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.